Om Vande Gurunam Charanavinde Sandarashita Svatma Sukhava Bodhe Nishe Yase Jangali Kayamani Samsala Hala Hala Morshantie Abahu Purushankaram Chakrakrasi Dharanam Sahasra Shirsam Svenam Pranamami Patanjali. Om. Thank you all, divine friends. Again, my name's Jeff Hippler. We're going to talk today for a little while about why Ashtanga Yoga is the most awesome practice ever. Before we get into the meat of the talk, I want to clarify two terms, what we mean by Ashtanga and what we mean by yoga. A lot of people watching this may not be familiar with Ashtanga, but Ashtanga is a great practice. I've personally been doing it for 20 some years. It's been my foundational practice. It's really been life changing from a physical perspective, and then even beyond the physical, which is where this talk is going to take us. But Ashtanga is characterized by 41 separate poses. It's a rigid practice of 41 poses. You do those 41 poses every day, speaking specifically about the primary series. And each pose you hold typically for 5 breaths. So you start out with a 30-minute standing series. Start out with your 5A sun salutations, 5B sun salutations. You go through the rest of the standing series, each pose being 5 breaths. Some poses, the asymmetrical poses, are right side and left side. Then you jump into your seated poses and you do your right side, your left side, each one for 5 breaths. And then you go on to your closing sequence and then enjoy Shavasana. Ashtanga Yoga, this practice was developed by Sri Krishnamacharya back in the early 1900s. Krishnamacharya is the really recognized as a founder of modern yoga. He really is underrated, even though that he's recognized as that, because he was born, November 18th, 1988, so almost 150 years ago. And he started out in a young age, really being schooled, educated, and then took up for many years as a traveling monk, walking with his bowl and his cup, trekking to the higher Himalayas, learning all of the secrets of yoga and from the higher masters on the oral traditions. And then finally, the king of Mysore hired him in to be under his patronage. That's where Pattabhi Jois came in, and he and Pattabhi Jois developed this method of Ashtanga Yoga. Pattabhi Jois made it his life mission to share this practice around the world. It started out, the history of the practice, in the olden days when you read the old books about when he was starting to teach it in the 50s and 60s is a lot different than it was lately when it's been Americanized, when he brought it over to the United States, talking to a lot of the old school teachers that were some of my personal teachers, talk about how a lot of that has changed. But a lot of it has stayed the same, and we get back to the roots, and that's what I want to talk about, is what really are the roots of the Ashtanga practice, and how we can go back to Krishnamacharya's vision and the original vision of Pattabhi Jois's Ashtanga Yoga. So that is the Ashtanga practice. It's got a reputation of being very difficult, very hard, very hardcore, very type A people. It doesn't have to be, and really it shouldn't be, but that's part of the learning curve. That's part of the process that we follow. So that is Ashtanga. Yoga, yoga is, everything is yoga. You hear everything no matter what you do. Drinking yoga, goat yoga, asana yoga. Yoga is everything to everybody. But for this point, I'm talking about yoga is a path to self-realization. Yoga was given to us 3000 BC in the current form during the descension of Krishna at the beginning of the ascension of Kali Yuga. And it was developed as a path for us to realize ourselves. It's a spiritual path. It's a scientific path, a path of self-realization, of enlightenment, of moving beyond the physical. And so that is going to be our definition of yoga for this discourse. So Ashtanga, the physical practice, evolving towards the yoga, the path for enlightenment and self-realization. So with that as the intro, I want to give you 5 reasons why Ashtanga Yoga is the most awesome practice ever. The first reason is prana. Prana is really the foundation of Ashtanga Yoga. If you're ever into a public class and you see your teachers just doing amazing, incredible practice with incredible lightness and really not even efforting, and you see everybody else just sweating up a storm, struggling, panting, breathing hard, and you're like, what is the trick? There's got to be a trick. How can she be so amazing and effortless and I am not? The trick is prana. Prana is the foundation. If you can learn that out of this talk, that is plenty. But what is prana? Prana is the intelligent energy, is the best succinct definition I have seen for that. Paramahansa Yogananda used to call it life trans back in the 1920s to make it sound both acceptable and recognizable to the population then. But it is the energy that animates us. It's the energy that makes us breathe, makes us alive, turns the inanimate form of our body and allows it to animate. It is the energy that makes us think. Our brain waves is an energy wave. Those waves are waves of prana. Our senses, our ear, our physical organ of sense perception. We have a subtle organ of sense perception that feels the physical vibrations and then sends that energy through pranic packets into the brain. And so prana is how we communicate within our body and actually outside the body. The aura outside the body is a pranic energy that allows us to communicate cyclically with each others. So prana is um, everything. It is really the subtle energy that animates us to keeps us alive. And the practice of Ashtanga allows us to explore, understand, and learn what that subtle energy is. If you want to get a sense of it, think Tai Chi. You see those Tai Chi masters just moving their bodies without effort. They're just getting out of the way of their bodies and allowing the energy to just move and flow with the bodies. And those Tai Chi masters, you also look at them and you can just see how incredibly strong they are. And you know that strength doesn't come from muscular strength because muscular bodybuilding, getting muscles, just a long slab dead muscle is just a piece of meat, a piece of steak, is just muscle without prana. But a small muscle with directed prana becomes incredibly strong. As we hear stories of people, yeah, during um, panic times can do incredible feats of strength with their focus, with their normal musculature, can do that. So we know muscles are not the key to strength. It's really the prana. It's the trick of the practice. And one of the reasons why the Ashtanga practice is purposely hard is we have these hard postures, these hard practices for beginners, and they're designed for us to learn how to make it easy. The goal of the Ashtanga practice is really to learn how do you take a very hard, very grueling, very tiring practice and learned how do you make it easy. My first year doing Ashtanga, I would do the A's and B's sun salutations. I'd stop, take my pulse, it would be up to 180. I'd pant for a while. I'd finish the standing series, take my pulse again. I'd be down to 160, take a break. And it was really a killer. I didn't have anybody tell me for a long time that the practice is supposed to be easy. Really, my big breakthrough came from Rodney Yee. Forever grateful to Rodney. I used to go up to Columbus to Yoga on High every year, and he'd do a week-long workshop on yoga. And my breakthrough moment came when he called me out, called me up to the front of the class. Everybody's standing around watching me, and he told me to do my worst sun salutation ever. How bad can I do a sun salutation? So I did a sun salutation pretty bad. And he was like, no, 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 not bad enough. Do it worse. Do it incredibly bad. It took me about 10 tries to do a sun salutation. That was bad enough for his acceptance. And he's like, yes, that's how you do it. Don't be rigid. Don't worry about doing it right. Feel it. Let it flow. Let that flow go. Let it all go. It's one of those things like, you hear artists and painters and writers say, you have to know all the rules. Once you know all the rules, then you can break the rules. And that's how the practice is. Once you know the 41 postures, once you know how to move, then you can relax and not have to be so precise, but allow that energy to flow through the body. So it becomes an exercise in letting go. As Yogananda would often say, effortless effort is the key. Can we effort effortlessly? Which means we're allowing the prana to move us in through the practice. It's really nice to say, and you can hear me say it, and then you get down to the mat and you're like, how do I do that? How does effortless effort work? I don't understand. I can envision doing a really horrible practice, but I don't envision us getting where we need to go with that. And that's where the breath comes in, because we always equate prana with the breath. We know pranayama is breath movement, and so we like breath is pranayama. But in fact, breath is really a nice, convenient way to find pranayama. It's the prana is really hiding behind the breath. The prana is within the oxygen, within the energy of the oxygen. And so by knowing the breath, by feeling the breath, we can now feel the prana that's hiding behind the breath and find a way to use that. And so with using our breath, and that's why Ashtanga becomes nice, because it is a breath-centered practice. And once you start finding the Ujjayi breath, last year at Elefist, I gave a talk on how to do the Ujjayi breath, and how the Ujjayi breath isn't the old 1985 Darth Vader heavy breathing. It's really the modern Star Wars 9, 2010 Darth Vader, nice, soft, gentle breath. It's a heart-centered breathing technique where you just breathe softly, easily. Just let the breath flow. And just with the two breaths, you felt the energy of the presentation shifting. And with Ashtanga being fixed 41 postures, with it being 5 breaths in each posture, it becomes a practice that you can memorize. And not only memorize, but the body can memorize it, the breath can memorize it. So when you get onto the mat and you start to practice, breath leads. Everything follows the breath. Every inhale is long, makes length, allows that body to rise. Every exhale, Body goes in, body sinks, body settles. So you're just breathing and flowing. And once you find that connection between breath and flow, you start to find that magic trick that the master yogis, those awesome teachers that we have around, have discovered. And that's what we need to do is follow the breath with relaxed effort. Let the breath carry us. So we're just sitting on a paddleboard, the waves are carrying us, and we are just relaxed into the practice. I practiced for quite a few years before I started teaching. And I found teaching to be incredibly difficult because I was so used to breathing and following the body, I could not enunciate the poses. I could not think of what poses are next because you get into such the flow that the mind, yeah, slowly shuts off and you're just breathing and carrying on through. And just like you're singing a song, you know how when you sing a song, you get the melody, you get the words, and you can just get carried along in those words. It's like the melody is in the right side of the brain, the words are in the left side of the brain. And by following the melody and the words together, you're getting whole brain learning. And that's how you teaching a 4-year-old the alphabet. How do you teach them the alphabet? You teach them the alphabet by singing A, B, C, D, because the sound, the tune, the tempo of the music as one side, the analytical part becomes the other side. It becomes the whole brain activity. And that's what we're looking for in Ashtanga, is to find a way so that you can just get so into the practice, so into the mind, so into the breath that everything else is blocked out. And when I was teaching the practice back in the pre-pandemic days, I always I tried to achieve a silent practice where we would go in and we would practice in silence. The only thing we would do is follow the breath. I would set the tempo with the breath. Everybody else would breathe. We'd go 1, 2, 3, go, and we would just breathe through the practice. And most people with their eyes closed, you didn't need to hear because with the hearing, you lose the breath. With the instructions, you lose the breath. And with the eyes open, you can also lose the breath consciousness. Yet we're all in rhythm. And when somebody got the wrong pose, we could all feel it. You get so into the prana, so into the energy, you feel the energy from everyone else. And really, there isn't another practice out there like Ashtanga that just really allows you to drop into that level of place. And to drop in, you have the difficulty of the practice. It is a difficult practice till you get the trick. And you need to kind of surrender to the breath, surrender to the energy, give up the willpower, and just say, okay, I give up. I'm just going to breathe and flow. And that's when the practice kicks, when you're like, you surrender. Devotional surrender is the key to higher learning, both in the practice and in your spiritual endeavors. So, number one, prana. Remember, Ashtanga Yoga from Patanjali or from Pattabhi Jois is a pranic practice disguised as a physical practice. Number two, zoning out. As I alluded to already, when you're doing the practice, you get into a zone. You hear about athletes that just get into a zone. They are just so centered, so focused, nothing bothers them. They are just in a complete zone. Uh, they block everything out. The football players don't hear the crowd noise. The skiers that are going down the slope, they just don't see anything besides the flag in front of them. They are just totally in the zone. And that is the next step of Ashtanga Yoga is once you get the breath going, once you feel the prana going, you just find a zone. And by having no music in the background, or when I do play music, it's soft music, and within a couple A's and B's, nobody's hearing the music. The music just blends into the background because you don't feel you don't hear the music, you just feel the energy going around. And how do you get into that zone state? How do you find a way to really get into the zone? And the way to get there is by doing a simple repetitive practice over and over and over again allows you to zone. I mean, you could think beyond um, yoga practice and think about prayers, think about mantras, think about chanting, think about learning the ABCs. Just simple repetitive motions allow you to get into the zone. Simple motions, following the breath, you can get into the zone while you're understanding what the prana is. If you've got any ex-boyfriends that you can think of that were really into video games, you can then understand how getting into the zone, you don't hear anything, everything is blocked out. You are just elite athlete, just doing your practice. And that is really why Ashtanga is great, because the practice works the body, but it doesn't need a teacher to lead. Group practices are incredible because everybody, including myself, that finds that when you're practicing together, that supportive energy that we all bring helps elevate us all to a higher level, and we can find a much deeper practice as a community. So, number two is our ability to zone out. The third reason Ashtanga is incredible is intense focus. Ashtanga, we have 5 breaths for each pose. And if when you're doing those 5 and you get into the practice, when you're reasonably proficient, you get into that practice and you're like, okay, I've got 5 breaths. The first breath, I'm just going to find a semblance of the pose. The second breath, oh, I'm starting to drop into it. The third breath, oh, I can feel my breath. I can feel the energy. I can start to really feel the pose. Then you're like, oh, I only have 2 breaths to really explore the depth of this posture. And then I move on to something else. And so it becomes really quick, really fast. At first, the practice, those 5 breaths seem to be really fast, but then time slows down and you're flowing through there and you're thinking about all 5 breaths. And you're like, oh, each breath has its own unique property, its own unique role in there. And if you're zoning out and just like runners that are just zoning and just cruising and doing mile after mile, they get that zone, but they don't really have that intense focus that also takes it up to that higher level. And it really, for me, it really hit me that focus level. If you're familiar with the Ashtanga practice and you're doing those seated poses and you do that seated on the right side, you do the vinyasa, you do the seated on the left side, you do the vinyasa, you pick another right side pose and you keep cruising through. That was when the practice became really focused for me. Because then I'd drop into a pose and I'd be like 5 breaths here. And I'd find myself zoning out on number 2. And I'd realize, oh, I didn't even have the awareness of that pose. I'm like, that pose is gone. And I fell asleep during it. It's like, no, you have to stay focused. Each breath has its own focus points. And so by focusing, we are able to get into that zone. And so that is number 3 is following the breath, keeping that, or number 3 is having that intense focus. And by following that intense focus, we find that the time changes. We kind of have a different sense of time during that focus point. We are aware that we're practicing, but those standing poses that take typically about 29 to 31 minutes, you're like, wow, those fly by. The seated poses take about 40 minutes, usually an hour and 15 in before you start the closing sequence. And you're focused, and then you're like, wow, where did that time go? In the practice, the time is done, both from being in the zone and that intense level of focus. So one is prana, two is zone out, three is intense focus. Number four is the flow. And getting into the flow is key. When you're in the flow, I like to equate it with driving. When you just get on the highway, yeah, you're driving to a new city, you're watching the map, you're following the directions, you're stressed out at every little thing, you're not familiar with the territory, and the drive seems very long, very arduous, very, yeah, tiring. But once you get into that focus and then you start driving, especially if you're driving through a rainstorm, through a snowstorm. We did a lot of trips to Cleveland over the last few years, and we got that trip down very well. And you sit down and you get in the car and you just get into that mental state of flow where you are aware that you are driving. You're sitting there, you're kind of watching yourself driving. Your eyes and ears are kind of awake. They are responding good enough for your driving needs, but for the most part, they're not engaged. Your passenger could say, "Oh, did you see those cows by the side of the road?" And you're like, "Nope, I'm just driving. I'm just cruising along. Time doesn't matter. I'm focused on my tasks. I'm very relaxed, very little effort, but I am totally in the flow." And pro athletes really talk about in the flow a lot. And being in the flow is a different level than just being in a zone. In a zone, everything is blocked out. But when you're in this flow, everything comes together. Everything is blocked out except your single point of focus. And that single point of focus becomes everything you are working at. And if you try it, you talk about efforting. You hear athletes talk about, oh, I tried too hard. I didn't just let it happen. And driving, if you suddenly like, oh, I'm going to try to drive, it's like, oh, it shifts. And your asana practice is the same way. Once you get to a certain level of proficiency, just let it happen. Just get into the flow. See what that flow does. And you'll still have that awareness that you're practicing. Next time you're driving, pay attention. You're like, oh, I have an awareness that I'm driving, yet I have that sense that I'm not really driving. It's like I am being driven. I'm watching myself drive. I am the observer. I am the seer. I'm no longer the doer. And that happens from repetitive practice and finding that ease, that effortless effort. So, four reasons so far. One, prana. Prana enables everything because prana is life. Prana allows us to experience life, to see what's going on. The breath that we breathe breathes in prana, and we find the prana through the breath, through a breath-centered practice. So that is where we are at. Um, Number two is zoning out. Once you prana, you can zone out and just get deep into the zone. Number three, your intense focus. You can totally focus on your action. Number four, getting into the flow. And now number five. Number five is the postures themselves. You probably thought I was going to start out that number five reason for the key reason that Ashtanga Yoga is incredible is all of the postures, but I intentionally save that for last because, for one, it's obvious, and for another one, without the build up, you don't really understand why the postures are that key, why they're important. But for one, the practice is really intelligently well sequenced. You have the standing practice that allows you to get the whole body warmed up. Those A salutations are so breath centered, so breath focused that they allow you to drop into the breath without losing that focus. And once you get the whole body warmed up with those large muscle groups on the um, sun salutations in the standing series, the seated series let you work those small little pieces, those little small musculatures that you're working on, those small blockages. And also the other piece that you can see inside the practice are the pranic loops. When you're grabbing your big toe on Padangusthasana, when you're having your hands under your feet on Padahastasana, those become pranic loops. As the pranic flows, as you just can't have a dead end because prana loves to flow. And all those postures have hidden structures built into them so that the prana can flow. If you've studied Tai Chi and you watch some of those Tai Chi masters doing horse dance for hours on end, and you realize that it's not the musculature holding them up, but the postures themselves are designed so that the prana can flow and support the practice. And so each of the postures in the Ashtanga series, triangle, grabbing the big toe, lifting the arm up, you have that pranic loop from the ham to the leg, creating that loop. And the structure of that pose directs the prana naturally to areas of the body that are needed for that posture. So while you're breathing and moving the breath, you don't have to consciously think, oh, I need to move prana to my left hand in this posture, because the postures are designed to move prana where it's needed. Because again, prana is intelligent energy, and it's the intelligence of the energy coupled with the structure of the poses that makes it all happen. And so a hidden benefit of the postures. Another part of the postures is in a seated posture, there are a lot of seated postures, lots of hip openers. And why do we have all those hip openers in Ashtanga? And it's really so that we can sit comfortably. You need a comfortable seated asana, a not comfortable seated poses in order to develop your practice beyond asana that we'll get to in a minute. But you have that seated postures, you have hip opens, you can sit comfortably on the floor with cross-legged. The first time I tried to sit and meditate, I was really excited, got my instructions, said, okay, now sit on the floor. And I was like, I think I sat for maybe 10 seconds. And I found out my body just collapsed. My lower back was tight. My structure was not integrated. I could not just sit up straight like I am now for hours on end. I couldn't even do 60 seconds. And so strengthening the body so that we can have a nice, firm, comfortable seated posture. Stiram Sukham Asana, they say in the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. A strong but steady and comfortable pose is where the Ashtanga will lead you to by sitting there, strengthening your core muscles, lengthening the back, loosening the lower spine, opening the hips, allows us to sit with ease, as well as opening the chest and shoulders and allowing that prana to flow, opens up the pranic channels in the body, so then the prana can just flow easier. As you see people talk about how yoga gives them a certain lightness. It makes them feel lighter, makes them feel more energized. And that is the prana coupled with the opening of the pranic channels within the body through the practice. The other hidden things you might not appreciate from the Ashtanga practice is the psoas muscle. As we doing boat pose, you do extended hand to big toe pose. We do a lot of work on strengthening, but both also softening the psoas muscle. And the psoas muscle is key for our breath. If we can't uh, maintain control of that psoas, we're not going to be able to get a long, deep, slow, controlled breathing that we're going to need for our pranayama practice. And so it works the psoas very well. Other things are, we do a lot of shoulder stands in Ashtanga. Shoulder stands are really great lower neck openers and allow you to get into a deep chin lock, our Jarlandhara Bandha, to be able to drop that chin in, lock the throat lock in our pranayama practice. That also allows us to get there, and that comes from the shoulder stand practice. Setu Bandhasana, the last seated pose in the primary series, where we open our chest and balance on the back of the head, which is really contraindicated unless you've got a really good teacher or are like under the age of 10. But if you can get into Setu Bandhasana, that is the practice to strengthen and create flexibility in the neck for murcha pranayama as we get into the deeper pranayama practices. The structure and the postures of the practice is all encompassing. So we're halfway into it. Let's do a recap of the 5 reasons we're doing it. We'll start with number 5, then go 1 through 4. So number 5, postures, then prana, then zoning out, then concentration, then getting into the flow. If you are familiar with the Yoga Sutras, you might see a parallel in there because these 5 reasons are really our asana, our pranayama, our zone out is our pratyahara, our intense focus is our dharana, and then the flow, once you get into the flow, that's our meditative flow. That's dhyana. And so Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga is really the same thing as Pattabhi Jois's Ashtanga Yoga. Ashtanga, Ashtau means 8 in Sanskrit, and Pattabhi Jois intentionally named Ashtanga Yoga after the 8-limbed system of Patanjali. People would ask Pattabhi Jois, why doesn't he teach yoga philosophy? Why doesn't he teach the Yoga Sutras? Why does he just teach the asana? And he would just say, well, practice is all incoming. Practice and all is coming. He'd say, the Yoga Sutras, the Eightfold Path of the Yoga Sutras, is buried within his 41 postures, within his Ashtanga Yoga physical practice. So let's explore that a little bit more. First off, who was Patanjali? I mean, Patanjali, was a divine sage. He really only lived into his mid-30s, and he was here about 5,000 years ago, a little bit before the Mahabharata War, before the descension of Krishna and the writing of the Bhagavad Gita. That was the era of Patanjali. And Patanjali was a teacher. He taught his group of students, and he was an advanced teacher. And his goal was to teach his students how to achieve enlightenment, how to become self-realized masters, because that was his goal, and that was the goal of yoga. But right before the Mahabharata War, at the end of the descension of the previous Yuga cycle, at the beginning of Kali Yuga, things were kind of chaotic back then. And I think we can all kind of relate to the chaos as we're finishing up the end of this cycle of the ascending period of Kali Yuga and starting into the ascending cycle of Dvarpa Yuga in the very near future. We feel this sense of chaos. And so what Patanjali was seeing was his students were just kind of being overwhelmed with lots of different yoga stuff, a lot of um, incorrect knowledge, a lot of non-focused information, a lot of stuff that was not contributing to their specific development along the path. And the goal of a good teacher is to help their students along on their individual paths. And so what did was he was asked to put together a short little manual for his advanced students. It's like, here, my advanced students, here are my 190 some sutras that will help keep you on this path. And so that became the Yoga Sutras. You can think about it as a little pocket manual for advanced yogis to be able to achieve enlightenment. And the Yoga Sutras are, if you study the paths of yoga, they are Raja Yoga techniques. Raja Yoga is the royal path, the most efficient path of enlightenment. And so that's what he was teaching them. And so with the key that we take away that we have a most familiarity with in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra are the Eightfold Path. Um, the yamas, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, the eight paths to enlightenment. And so that is what Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, the Eightfold Path, Ashtanga Yoga is about. In this talk, we haven't talked about the yamas and niyamas because yamas and niyamas, they're kind of the right to practice. They develop concurrently with the other six limbs. And we see that in Pattabhi Jois's Ashtanga Yoga, as you see people that start doing that practice, start living a more ethical life. They stop eating meat. They start becoming more conscious of their environment. It becomes a co-evolution. And so the namas and niyamas are a subject for a whole different talk that we'll do another day. But yamas and niyamas, the right to practice, the 10 commandments of yoga. Beyond that, you have asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dhyana, and dharana. All five of those 5 steps are the path to samadhi. And those 5 reasons are those 5 reasons I just laid out as why Ashtanga Yoga is the most incredible practice ever. Because asanas, you need to do the asanas. We need to have a healthy body. If you're a scientist and you're going to do some deep explorations, you need a very healthy instrument, a very well-tuned instrument to be able to do your studies. And so if we're going to study the science of yoga, we need a very healthy, very strong, very well-refined instrument for doing that. That refined instrument is our bodies, of course, and our tools are our prana. And so that's why asana is so key for us to be able to get there. We have asana, we have pranayama. Pranayama is buried within the Ashtanga Yoga system. I, as a teacher, have had trouble teaching people pranayama because you can't get beginning students to sit down and want to breathe. Even teaching alternate nostril breathing and beginning techniques is very difficult because if you don't have the body, you don't have the sense of prana, they don't work. You can't find it. And if the practice doesn't really work, if you don't find the practice within the practice, you're not going to stick with it long enough. And so what we as a society see is that we see results on the asanas. And so by focusing on the asanas first and then working the prana in as we progress on with the asanas, we can learn our pranayamas. The problem we see with Ashtanga is that as people get deep into the physical aspect of the Ashtanga practice and they get strength, they get flexibility, they lose sight of the goal. They lose sight of the goal of samadhi and realization, and they turn it into an athletic endeavor, and they lose that next step of finding the prana. But finding prana is the trick. It's the key. It's the secret behind Ashtanga Yoga. And prana is also the key to enlightenment and realization. Kundalini Yoga is all about lifting the Kundalini buried into the bottom chakras, lifting it up in through the higher energy centers, raising our energies, raising our sights. Kundalini Yoga is all about creating that awareness, that sense, that palatable sense of knowing where that prana is and being able to move it as will. Also, Nipatha Yoga, the descension of defined um, of universal consciousness. That was a yoga that Sri Aurobindo, if you followed Sri Aurobindo at all, he mastered the Nipatha Yoga method of precipitating divine consciousness from the higher realms into the body through the higher energy centers, in through the chakras. It's all the pranayama, these pranic techniques are all fundamental to Raja Yoga, all fundamental to the royal yoga path. And so they're buried deep within Pattabhi Jois's Ashtanga Yoga practice. And by learning to do the prana through the moving practice, through the asana practice, we get our ability to learn our seated pranayama and learn to do the seated pranayama and seated in such a way that we see the tangible benefits and want to continue working on those pranic techniques. And I've worked with a number of teachers trying to teach Ashtanga to beginners, and it is so tough because the beginners want to learn the postures. They have to learn the postures. But after you teach them the postures, how do you switch gears and say, okay, don't do the postures anymore. Give me a really horrible practice. Teach really badly. Give me a bad practice so you can find the prana. And you almost feel like you're pulling the rug out from under the kids. It's like teaching them how to write um, the alphabet using block letters. And then once they get to second grade, you're like, oh, forget block letters. We're going to teach cursive. Everything I taught you is wrong because we're going to teach you something different now. And so we have to continue to evolve as students. We continue to evolve as teachers to help them along their higher path. So we have asana, we have pranayama, we have pratyahara, the fifth step. Pratyahara is getting deep into the zone. As you get into the zone, pratyahara is defined as interiorization. We turn off our senses. Yogananda would say back in the 20s when they had switchboards, he's like, we're just unplugging the cables from the switchboards going to our brain. We're disconnecting those pranic channels affecting the brain so that you're yelling at your ex-boyfriend to stop playing video games and he doesn't hear you at all. It is just totally in the zone, totally non-communicative because they are just zoned out, and that is control of the prana. That is pratyahara. And we've all experienced that in various parts of our lives when we are have our senses turned off. So we have yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana. Dharana is concentration. It's concentration on a single point, a single simple task as we are focusing on one item. And we often get confused as to what happens first. You're playing video games, you're concentrating on the game, and everything is zoned out. And um, your partner keeps saying, yelling at you, it's like, oh, stop playing, we need to change the laundry. And you're like, oh, be quiet, I'm concentrating. And it's like, oh, it's not the concentration that brings the pratyahara. Because if the concentration brought the pratyahara, then the concentration would not be interrupted by the sense perceptions. It's the other way around. Disabling the sense perceptions allows us to concentrate, and concentration is key because the brain can really only concentrate on one item at a time. Just like a computer can only process one piece of information at a time. You think of a supercomputer, the supercomputer has no keyboard, no monitor, it just is sitting there just thinking. Whereas a PC is sitting there um, giving you information, but it's always has its background tasks. If you've ever done Control Alt Delete, look at background tasks, you can see it's always going back, searching for keystrokes, looking for mouse clicks, and it is chews up a certain percentage of the background information because it can't totally concentrate on what it's doing. And so by concentrating on a single point, you can really get deep into a zone and become wrapped into it, just like driving allows you to really get deep into a place where you are concentrating. So that's concentration, and I gave this long-winded explanation because after dharana is dhyana, meditation. And meditation is a bit confusing because when we are meditating, what are we doing? We are concentrating on a single point because that concentration is equivalent to the flow. We talked about flow with Ashtanga. We're in the flow. We are just focusing on those 5 breaths. It's like driving the car. You're in the flow. You are aware you're doing the practice. You're aware you're doing the breath. You are aware you're driving. But you are so into the zone that you are identifying with that object of concentration. I did that once. Video games is a perfect analog for this. Back many, many years ago, I used to play a very simple video game called Load Runner. It was on a 5.5-inch floppy on a black and white computer screen, very simple, but I played it once for like 5 hours. I got in and I got into such a zone that time stopped. I was really the character on the screen. It was right, left to move and to shoot blocks. If anybody's seen an old Load Runner game, it is such a simple but so enthralling game due to its incredible simplicity. And I played it once for many hours. I realized that I was just so sucked in so deep that after I finished, I never picked up the game again. But it was like over 30 years ago, and it was still such a memorable experience being to be so intimately tied into the character that you are. It's like I was no longer hitting mouse buttons. I was no longer moving. I was seeing what the character was seeing. I was feeling what the character was seeing. I was so attached that I was engaged into the game. That's meditation. When you're so identified, you are identified with your object of concentration, but you still have an awareness that you um, are playing the game. And that is a great analog is Zelda. If it's never been a game that I've been attached to, I kind of freaked out after Load Runner to get too deep into those games. But you can see how you can play Zelda and become the character Zelda, and you spend your time trying to save the princess, trying to slay dragons, trying to gather as much gold as you can, and you become obsessed with it. You're like, oh, I am just that character. I am that character on the screen, and I am just watching the screen. And you get so deep into the concentration, so deep into the pratyahara that you are really meditating, in a way, meditating into the game. And that meditation is the path to samadhi, because samadhi is defined as a state where you are completely immersed into that object of contemplation. So You have yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, no senses, dharana, concentration, dhyana, meditation, and samadhi. Samadhi, that state where you are immersed into that object of meditation. And I like to call that um, feature of being immersed into Zelda as sort of like a reverse samadhi. Because when you're um, deep in samadhi, technically in meditation, you are concentrating, contemplating, meditating on a object of um, of the self, an object of divinity. You are meditating on God, so you are merging with God. You are meditating on the self, and so you are identified with your higher self. You are not lowering yourself and meditating on a lower being, but you are meditating, concentrating, trying to merge to higher beings, higher energies, higher ideals, meditating on love, meditating on prana, meditating on God, guru, on blessings, merging with those becomes our life's goal, becomes a goal of samadhi, becomes a goal of self-realization so we can realize who we are. But you take this analog and say, oh, if we are meditating on Zelda and we become Zelda, and then we become trapped as the Zelda character, and um, we have these latent desires of keep wanting to go back to the game. We feel we are Zelda. We need to go back. We need to collect more gold. We need to get more gold. We value ourselves by how much gold we have in there, by how we're able to capture the princess. We have internal glory by how well we can slay the dragon and how great our tools are. And we have our karma because whatever you do in the Zelda game is gonna come back. You have a lot of gold there. You don't want to quit because you're like, oh, I have a lot of gold. I can't quit playing this game. I've got to keep playing. I am trapped. And if you can see where I'm going, this is our reality now because we are trapped not in the Zelda character, but we are trapped in our human character. We are trapped as identifying as ourselves within these bodies, not trapped as identified as Zelda, but we are still trapped in these bodies. We are seeking gold. We're seeking to save the princess. We are having glory over all the weapons and tools we have. And the more gold we have, the harder it is to walk away from the lives we have because it becomes an entrapment. And meditation on the divine becomes our escape, a way of disengaging that trap, realizing that we are not just the body, but we are divine beings beyond space and time. We are the witness to what's going on, just as if we are the witness to ourselves driving down the highway. We are observing that we are driving, we are observing that we are meditating, we are observing that we are doing our asana practice. Also, the only step between meditation and samadhi is once you've achieved samadhi, you are immersed so greatly that you forget that you are actually meditating. You are so deep in your meditation that you are completely merged. Just like we are so deep into our personal reality from our sense organs telling us that we are this reality, that we forget that we are divine spiritual beings beyond space and time. And so that is why Ashtanga Yoga is the most awesome practice ever, because the Ashtanga Yoga of Patanjali, Jois, and Sri Krishnamacharya leads us to the Ashtanga Yoga practice of Raja Yoga of Patanjali. And the Ashtanga Raja Yoga of Patanjali leads us to self-realization so that we can realize that we are infinite divine beings beyond space and time through our paths to achieve Samadhi. And that, dear friends, is why Ashtanga Yoga is the most incredible practice ever. Thank you so much for your divine inspiration and for all your attention. I'll close with the Ashtanga closing prayer. Om Svasti Prajabhya Palyalpyantam Nayena Margena Mahim Mahishaha Go Brahmanyebhya Shivanastu Nityam Lokaha Samastaha Shukino Bhavantu. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you. Purnamadaha Purnamidam Purnat Purnamidachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Namaste.